The squirrel was magic!
Beware your human heart. This is the Diabolical Index for Monday, December 10th, 2018, where the pages of the uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson, as always. Tonight we are in the Nut House for my second return to the podcast after a long little while. Tragedy and adventure and all kinds of things that had gone on, so that's where I've been. But I'm back now. This is, I'm calling this the episode 0+1, because we're not back on the regular intervals and the regular index entries as normal. But that's okay, because we have a special, very, very special episode tonight where I'll be interviewing a honest-to-goodness, badass author. It happens all the time on the internet, but this will be the first time on the Diabolical Index for an interview, and I'm really looking forward to it because we've kind of, I mean, to say that we worked together before might be stretching a little bit. We definitely collaborated on some fun stories and different things in the past. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Brooke Warra. Brooke, are you there?
Yes.
Hey, Brooke, what's going on?
Not much. Talking to you.
Well, that's
watching my cat be a spaz. As soon as we got on here, my cat decided to freak out.
Oh, isn't that always the way? Is there anything that you can do that a cat doesn't want to be a part of in some kind of way and improve?
No, actually, this particular cat is especially needy. I can't hold the phone or a laptop or anything without him having to attack it.
Have there ever been any instances where he's kind of flopped onto the keyboard and actually improved a sentence for you?
yeah, for sure.
That's cool. Okay, well, we got some really cool things to talk about your career and the legacy that you're putting out there. Why why don't you just kind of explain what it is, what kind of stuff that you normally write? What's the flavor of what you do? We have a podcast called Heckles and Horror that deals with kind of like the horror film genre, and I'm sure that that TJ, hopefully TJ, he might be in the middle of some other stuff, but hopefully he checks this out because I'm sure he'd be really interested. But how would you characterize what you put on the page?
Well, as you know, I'm primarily a short story writer, so I haven't written a novel yet, which really drives my parents crazy. But I think I fall in the category of weird fiction, which is a subgenre of horror, and I tend to use a lot of magical realism, so it'll be like our world and our timeline, but then people's hands will catch on fire spontaneously, and that's just kind of a regular occurrence, I guess. It's accepted that kind of stuff just goes on.
Well, I have real vested interest in magical reality. I'm kind of glad that I'm not a gigantic fan of classifying things, but in this case, it makes it a little easier to talk about. Like in the case of, I don't know if you've seen the film Mandy that just came out recently.
Oh man, I have not seen that yet.
It's been very extremely polarizing among my friends, but it definitely has that magical realism where you've got, you know, just a normal person, a normal world, but when you take a look around in their surroundings and, you know, into the sky, you see like red storms of crazy like manic energy and people. There's an ethereal. Mandy is kind of an ethereal person, but she, you know, she wears a Black Sabbath shirt and she works in a little hand-me-down shop and stuff. But she has some kind of inner glowing and inner special inside that that like a cult leader can pick up on. So like there are all kinds of things. There's kind of like an Excalibur type vein to it, and there are things that make men more than men and all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a thread of that goes through that. I totally recommend it. A lot of people have misgivings about it. I think that the trailer, I don't know. When I saw the trailer, it ended up being exactly what I thought it was going to be, but there's been some debate. But anyways, yeah, with the magical realism, I'm definitely a gigantic fan of that, especially since it kind of it reels people in because it's familiar, but then at the same time it's fantastical.
Right. I think they call that like the uncanny valley, where it's something that looks familiar, but it's just wrong enough that it kind of stands the hair up on the back of your neck because you know it doesn't quite fit. I like stories that go to that place, the uncanny valley. And I do need to check that movie out. I've heard tons about it, and like you said, all of my friends, it's like they either really loved it or they absolutely hated it. But for the most part, I think most of what I've heard was really good. And then it's like the one film that I didn't get around to this last year yet.
I wanted to answer a question. We've had some questions coming up off of Twitch and different places, but Josh the Forge, I definitely wanted to put out there that the name of the movie they were referring to is Mandy. It stars Nicolas Cage and Linus Roach, and it's put out by XYZ Films. And like I said, it's very polarizing. People are completely split down the center. I haven't heard an indifferent word about it. People either hate it or they love it. I have an idea about kind of like movie lovers in the 21st century, and as far as I can tell, there are people who love The Witch and there are people who hate The Witch, and there's not really a third direction on that. But
right, there is no gray area.
Yeah, so you agree with that statement then? Definitely.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah, I
cool.
agree with that.
Would you say that are there any trends currently in horror or weird fiction that you've been picking up on that have gained ground or maybe have fallen by the wayside in the last few years?
Oh my gosh, yes, so many actually. So I have noticed that horror, even in the mainstream horror, is kind of leaning more toward that like kind of magical realism and bringing in like fairy tale elements. And then I'm not sure if you saw Hereditary,
I haven't
but
yet. I haven't yet. That was kind of on my list with Mandy, and there's a third one that I've missed out on, and I can't remember what it was. But that's another polarizing one where I haven't heard a third way. People hate it or they love it.
I absolutely loved it. And I think that was a little bit of an extreme example of how people are kind of using trauma and tragedy as horror.
I see.
And I really love that, obviously, because that's totally in my ballpark. I think it's awesome that we're kind of taking relatable experiences, and I've always kind of said that writing is kind of like putting a note in a bottle, like an SOS, and sending it out into the world and waiting to see who reads it and is like, I feel this way too. So it's exciting to see horror kind of dealing with personal like traumas and experiences like that.
Do you think that that's kind of a divisive thing? It seems like I've heard a lot of talk about with, I think it might be you, Jennifer. Andrew said he'd hear us just fine, so I'm not sure. We'll keep an eye on that, but apparently we can be heard just fine, other than your technology. But we'll see. Hopefully they can hear us fine. But I've had some questions and some statements, but it seems like I've seen some talk about kind of like the magical. I don't know. It's difficult to characterize it without kind of falling into some sort of slur territory. But it seems like when especially in a child in a film has some sort, like in there in the spectrum, or if they have some kind of chromosomal defect, like they tend to be the ones like that are touched by the other side and stuff.
I'm really hoping that starts to fall away. I'm considered like disabled, and I just sort of feel like as a disabled person, it's like we're so tired of like being your magical like savior in the movies. So I think that's sort of something that I think society sort of started to realize, that like all their characters should be well-rounded, not just one thing.
Oh, sure. Yeah, especially since, I mean, it's really difficult, especially now, to characterize anyone with any sort of difference. It's difficult to say it's definitely this, it's definitely that. There's usually kind of like bits and pieces of one thing, bits and pieces of everything, especially like with their experience and, like you said, trauma. There's all sorts of things adding to the quilt of someone's experience. So you can't really chalk it off to one thing or another, especially since they also have used that race wise in the past as well. The mystical Asian, or the for the one that kind of springs to mind for me was like Poltergeist 2 with that gigantic chief guy from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah. I think that's the one probably everybody thinks of. I haven't watched that in a million years. Poltergeist, the first one, is my all-time favorite.
Yeah, we don't talk about remakes around here. Well, maybe some. There are some that work.
I don't have a problem with remakes. I don't understand this like automatic hatred for the remake.
Well, I'll be, but see, don't get me wrong now. Don't get me wrong, because I don't automatically have a hatred for the remake, especially since I mean, The Thing from the 80s, that's a remake, and I enjoyed that a whole lot. I enjoyed the remake of The Manchurian Candidate, and it's one of those things where when a remake comes out, you kind of, for me anyway, personally, I totally treat it with all kinds of caution, and it's kind of on the firing line. And then I mean, especially, I mean, I'm always of the opinion that if something is really done right the first time, if you remake it, you have to improve it. And if you just
Well,
kind
I
of like
think
replicate it or, whatever.
it was like right after you and I first met, and I was so excited for the Poltergeist remake. And do you remember, like, I took my whole family to see that on, like, my birthday.
I can't remember what the
And
aftermath of that was.
it was horrible. I ranted on Facebook for, like, 2 days. I was so angry and disappointed.
Oh, God.
It was awful. And I still am, for the most part, willing to give remakes a chance. But I do somewhat temper my excitement now because I was so stoked for that. And then it was just within 5 minutes of the opening, I realized like their timing was going to be all off, and it just didn't work. None of it worked very well.
Well, I love me some Sam Rockwell, so I was kind of pissed that I
Yeah.
didn't get to watch that because I just had a feeling in my gut that it wasn't going to be worth a damn. And
Sam Rockwell is awesome, and I still love him.
Moon, right?
There's nothing he could do about that movie being awful.
What about Moon? You like Moon?
I just watched Moon for the first
Yes.
time.
All right.
Like 2 or 3 days ago. That's crazy that you just brought that up. That's a good flick.
Oh yeah, I recommend that to everybody. But we're talking about we're talking to Brooke Warra, weird fiction horror writer, and she mentioned when we first met, and I think it's kind of important to bring that up. We had met. What was the name of the or not the podcast, but what was the site that I just kind of happened upon? And there was, I think if I remember right, they were having sort of like a volley, like a right back and forth in the comments of some posts where someone would start a story and then someone would pick it up at one point and write a little bit. That's that's how we met, wasn't it?
Yes, in Horror Fanatics. And so that was a group on Facebook. And I think the first time you and I actually spoke was you had posted kind of one of those what would you do if you saw this staring at you kind of pictures, and it was a horrifying photo.
That doesn't surprise me.
But you remember it's me saying this, and even though I'm a horror writer, I'm like terrified of everything.
Yeah.
And I think I probably told you, like, take this down. It's giving me nightmares or something.
Yeah, and I think I may have even kept it up even a little bit longer than I would have, but it was just a mischievous, thing. But yeah, we would get on these incredible volleys where I would write one piece of a story, she would write one piece of a story, and just like through the night into the early morning and stuff like that, and
Yeah,
and then
that was a lot of fun.
And then I found out about the stories that she was putting out there to everyone. And what would you say? What was the first story you ever wrote?
The first horror story I wrote was Sleepyhead. Which
I remember, yeah.
sent to you at that time. And I think you've pretty much beta read almost everything I've written since then.
Pretty awesome.
I'm like, what does Corey think about this?
And
before I send it anywhere.
Every once in a great while, I get a new person in my life that asks me to do that for them every once in a great while. But I remember bits and pieces of Sleepyhead because it's one of those ones like with the magical reality where you can totally you remember this little girl in your class. Anyone who would read this would remember this little girl in their class, and to see kind of like what her fate ended up being in, and what the her inclinations were, and what were the repercussions of what had happened to her and how she happened to other people. It was totally fascinating. Did that ever end up in any publications?
Yeah, it ended up in Under the Bed. I think it was volume 3. And then just this past year, it was on, I think, the Wicked Library podcast again. So that was cool. I got to hear it as a podcast, in addition to seeing it in print. And that's always super fun because, you know, podcasts will take your story and add music and actors, and it's like a whole new piece after that. So it's always really fun to see kind of what other artists are going to do with your story.
Oh, and we have a question from Jennifer. She's asking about if there are any, what if any, popular genre or author that you most sympathize with.
Oh man, that is like, well,
I'm
so
thinking,
hard to pick.
I'm thinking like somewhere in between, like if we're talking about the known authors and not kind of on the indie tip. I was thinking Charles DeLint was probably in there somewhere.
It's funny because it's a lot of my favorite authors anymore are, like Gwendolyn Keist or Nadia Bolkin, and they're both weird fiction horror writers, like in my same, community. But I think people are always a little taken aback that actually, even though horror is my favorite genre, I really love Charles Bukowski.
Well, of course.
And I really love Kurt Vonnegut. And I probably am more influenced by them. I know that I at least, I just love everything, every word that they've written.
I've noticed that, especially among the most seasoned horror writers, it seems like they very rarely, I mean, not rarely, but I would say that the majority of what they read and what they're influenced by isn't horror. I would say that it was mostly like not even necessarily fantasy, like maybe something like not Steinbeck. I'm not looking for Steinbeck, but something maybe like Flannery O'Connor or some sort of. I mean, in this case, you could say that Shirley Jackson kind of like crosses genre, every genre that you could possibly think of. She kind of like melds into
totally
and falls out of with everything she does. So I think that, especially when you're dealing with like the magical reality aspect of what you're talking about and kind of like the fantasy in the everyday world, I think that just focusing on horror or fantasy is going to kind of limit your scope when it comes to the emotional framework and fabric of people. And when you have that locked in,
So it's so important. Like, I'm teaching creative writing at the local college out here, and I'm doing a dark fiction class next semester. And it's like so important, I think, especially when you're doing genre writing.
Yeah.
And probably especially in horror, to really portray like the heartbreak or like the ugliness in maybe a character's experience, or just kind of maybe like an embarrassing moment. And I think I find the inspiration for that a lot in writers like Bukowski that like aren't afraid to just tell it how it is.
Oh, sure.
And then like want to bring that into the horror genre because it's entertainment first and foremost. That's what writing is. You're entertaining, and that's okay. But your job is to like connect with your reader. And I think that if you're bringing in like those emotions and like kind of that maybe stuff we don't really always want to talk about into the work, then you're connecting with your reader more.
Absolutely. I have Josh DeForge of the Running Scared motion picture group. He said that he's going to hit you up and he wants to buy a signed book and review it on his podcast as well. So I'll send you some information on Josh. He's a huge booster of the indie horror, indie fiction of all kinds, bizarro fiction, and fledgling filmmakers and fledgling authors and stuff. So I'll make sure to give you his information. Really, really super guy. So let's see. Jennifer's saying that the avid reader, and Jennifer definitely falls into that category. She is voracious. horror reading is at least half of what you call classic literature. So she's probably talking
Yeah.
about like the Gothic, like you can get into like the Rebecca, the Daphne du Maurier,
Right.
or like the Monk, or things like that. Have you ever
Frankenstein.
read
Oh,
Gormenghast?
I have not.
Yeah, it's one of those trilogies that people are constantly suggesting to me, and it's in that Gothic vein. But how long have you been doing the college class now?
Almost a year.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
almost a year.
Do you have
Yeah,
any?
it's fun.
I remember we had spoken about the curriculum and how that was kind of grinding on your mind. Did that end up working out good?
It did. I was so nervous about it, because I'm like, well, I just published my little short stories, and you know how writers always kind of, we have imposter syndrome. I think every single one of us. And so I'm like, I was just thinking, like, what am I going to get up in front of all these people and talk about this stuff like I even know what I'm doing? And then I got my first class, and we just had a lot of fun, because it's mostly like just this discussion. And then, the class is usually 5 or 6 weeks long, and then I just walk them through writing a flash piece, and they pick where they're going to submit. And by the end of the course, we all submit our stories together.
Oh, that's exciting. Did you have
super fun.
Did you have one in particular that you were submitting to, or just whatever you thought that most fit the piece that somebody was doing?
I help them kind of figure out where they're going to send it. Most of the people who have been taking my classes so far, because it's like kind of a general writing class, have been writing sort of like essays and memoir style. So I sort of had to learn really fast some things about that market, because I'm not, I'm like a horror writer, and they're like, well, I have this essay about the summer I was 12, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can totally help you find a home for that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's and that could easily Stephen King wouldn't exist if there wasn't horror in the child. If there wasn't
right.
if a child's beginnings wasn't one of wonder and complete terror at most of the mundane things that we deal with on a daily basis. But
yeah, absolutely.
but when like speaking of the child, like tell us about Heirloom. It was featured last year in the Dim Shores anthology, Looming Low Part 1.
Yes. Yeah, so that was a really fun project to be a part of. It was kind of like this massive project. They had 26 authors, so 26
Good
stories
God.
in one anthology. Yeah, it was huge. And then it debuted at Necronomicon.
Oh man,
in 2017.
Perfect. Good God,
so
that is awesome.
Yeah, I flew out there for the debut, and then we all got to do our readings and stuff. That's when I met Peter Straub.
Oh, wow.
Totally by accident. And he's a really nice guy. And then
I've often wondered what he was like.
He's super nice. He's very nice, very approachable. I told him, I was like, my parents are never going to believe me that I actually met you. And he was like, well, let's take a picture. So I got to take a picture with him, and he was just very... it's kind of funny with writers, because I think even like those huge names, like they don't get like how important they are.
Oh, sure.
You're standing there next to Peter Straub and being like, oh my God, like Ghost Story.
Oh, Jennifer is freaking out right now. She is freaking out that you were sitting next to Peter Straub.
It was so cool. I'm still freaking out. And this was like a year and a half ago, and I'm freaking out that I got to meet Peter Straub.
Well, I mean, Ghost Story is definitely in my... I mean, you know how it is. Like, it's difficult to say top 20, top 50. There are just so many, but He's definitely up in there somewhere. But you are talking to a guy who has never read The Talisman, if you can believe that.
Oh, man. Oh, you gotta read that, though.
I mean, I ended up getting a copy just recently of the I don't like that kind of like pared down, like when Black House came out, and they pared
Yeah,
down. They took kind of like what I think of as like the Stephen King font of like the 80s, when they took the
right.
and kind of like the Nike swoosh talisman thing in the center. When they got rid of that
Yeah.
and they just kind of put type on there, I wasn't a big fan of that edition. So I searched around for the original Stephen King font one, and I got that, and it's just kind of sitting there waiting for me to dive into
You
that.
gotta read it. You gotta read it. You really do. That's a classic, man.
With the James Big Curly James Grant, I would definitely suggest. I mean, this is totally a plug for James, but he's asking a question. But before that, if you ever need any creature design, any sketch for like a sketch illustration of some sort of creature in your work, definitely let me know. I'll get James on that. But um,
Awesome.
he's asking, what story have you written that you can say scares you? One that you put many of your own fears into, delve into the primordial fears of the readers, he asks.
Um, well, there is a couple, but I think, to be honest, the one that just got published in Bastarian, which is "I Feel Better Now," is the title of that story. That one kind of messed me up writing for so long that I didn't write another story for like 6 months.
Yeesh.
Yeah, I know. That's like forever.
But I mean, that's powerful,
Um,
though. I mean, especially if you really dug deep into your own, duality and stuff like that. I mean, that when that comes out, I mean, it's going to take a minute. There's going to be some fallout on that.
yeah, it was right around the 1 year anniversary of my sobriety. And I decided that I needed to write about kind of when I hit the 1 year mark, I was sort of like really angry about being sober.
Oh, okay.
So,
I don't hear about that a
it's
lot.
a thing that happens.
Okay.
um, you don't hear about it a lot, but then like when you're in recovery and you're like, why am I so like angry right now? People are like, oh yeah, that's a thing. Um, so I sat down and decided I was going to put into a story kind of my experience of being disabled, living with chronic pain, and also having an addiction. Like, those things can be really conflicting and confusing. And then all the people who are trying to help you, like, it's like they know that they're hurting you, but they're trying so much to help you. And
Okay.
I had to work that stuff out. So I wrote that, and then was completely shocked when it got into Vastarian. Actually, that sort of gave me a panic attack because I'm like, now people are going to read this like incredibly personal. I turned my addiction into a horror story, and people are going to read it.
Well, I think that definitely I've heard a few things this way. Welcome, Desoro and Powdery Apple and Danny 13145. Welcome. We're talking to Brooke Warra, weird fiction horror writer, about her story. I Feel Better Now was published in Volume 1, Issue 3 of Vastarian, a literary journal, and how it deals with the duality of disability and addiction as horror. So in this case, I actually know the first book that I reviewed, analyzed. That I hesitate to say review. A lot of times I just kind of go through it and my own personal aspects that kind of came from it and different things. And I guess that it kind of like incidentally becomes a review. But the first book that I kind of handled on the Diabolical Index was Porcelain by Nate Southard, and who's also
Oh,
an old friend of mine. And
I got published with him
oh,
last year
small world.
in Strange Eons. I think we were published alongside each other.
Rock on. Do you remember what
Yeah.
story his was?
Let me actually have a copy
Oh man, you have it at hand.
of.
Cool.
I do right
Rock on.
here. So, mine in there was Cherub, And Nate's was, oh my gosh, where is he?
Okay, you're talking about the beta testing. I haven't read Cherub, I don't think, have I?
Are you sure you didn't read that one? Because I feel like I stayed up until like 5 a.m. trying to write the intro to that story. And then in 2 hours, bam, I had this whole story done. And I thought, oh, you know what? I tried to send it to you. I couldn't get a hold of you. So I posted about it on Facebook. And that's how I got into Strange Eons. Because they were like, you have a story. We want to read it. But so Nate's story was A Taste of Sugar.
You know, that sounds really, really familiar to me. I think he may have mentioned that when we were talking about putting porcelain on, and he but the point I was getting to is that he had actually kind of I can't remember. I don't think it was on his blog. I think he had actually posted it, or he may not have posted it on his author blog. I think he made it post on a personal blog, but it was kind of like a I hesitate to call it a confession, but it was almost like this laying out of some secrets of his and different things, almost like you were talking about with your story. And for me, and I asked him about it later on, it seemed to me that despite the fear and the courage and just all those things, kind of like laying yourself bare and just kind of opening yourself up, I think that if I had to guess, and from what he told me and other people have told me, I think that it does nothing but help your work and help people relate to you more. And I mean, the fear of kind of laying your chest open, I think helps. I think that it kind of lets people into a different understanding that might help them understand and kind of propagate the tone of your story a little bit better around to their friends and stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely the goal. It's just, I think, when you're in the process of writing it, or like for me, especially after, like, start counting all the ways I didn't do the story justice. And it's just so hard to look at your own stuff and feel like it's any good, especially when it's really emotionally charged.
Yeah.
And then, and then other people are like, oh, we really like this. It's great. And you're like, as a writer, you're like, okay, so then you're getting other offers like, hey, can you write a story for us next? And you're like, what magical thing in that story is it that they actually like? Because now I have to replicate that somehow.
Oh God! But I mean, I think that's kind of rarely. I mean, it does happen. It definitely happens. But I think that most of the time, if you give something that's truly from you and you don't try too hard, you just be yourself and do what you normally would have done, I think that it's going to have that thread of authenticity throughout it, and it's going to have whatever quality they liked in the other one, it's going to have it anyway without trying too hard to replicate it anyway.
I think that's absolutely true. Actually, it's like, even if you're not going to some like deep emotional spot, if nothing else, if you're at least having like a really good time writing it, like I'm sure you've read books and stories where you're like, you can tell that the author was just having so much fun.
Oh, it's a blast.
Writing that story.
Absolutely. Oh,
I kind of feel that way when I read The Gunslinger, and that's another polarizing. I
had someone flat out tell me that they it was so funny because I thought that, because they were talking about, they said the Dark Tower series. They didn't say, well, the Dark Tower and talking about the Gunslinger, or saying the Dark Tower and talking about the Drawing of the Three. So they knew a little bit about what they were talking about. So I figured that, if anything, they were going to say that they couldn't quite get behind Wizards and Glass, or one of the later ones where he's like throwing everything out in the kitchen sink. But they said they hated the Gunslinger, and all I could think of was, basically what I told them was, I try, it doesn't always work, but I try not to like attack someone for hating something. What I normally do in this case anyway, it was kind of convenient, because I was just like, do me a favor. Why don't you read the next two and tell me if you still hate it? As the linking three of the first, the I mean, you can't call it a trilogy, but the first 3 of the Dark Tower series. If you hated the Gunslinger, go forward 2 more, and then if you still hate it, then I can get behind that, I guess. But I definitely loved those 3. I need to revisit the first 3, and then I need to go all the way, and I've never gone all the way. I listened to a lot of stuff
haven't.
like
I
that.
can't. I got, I think 3 or 4 books in. I actually didn't care for the series, but I love the first book.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, I feel like it really comes across the page that he was having a really good time writing that. And there is there's at least one short story and then another novella that he did. The short story is in one of his short story collections that's actually kind of a story that takes place at the same time that the Gunslinger does, where Roland's like in that was like little abandoned town with like the
I was gonna mention, is that tall?
frog
Is that
people or
tall?
something.
Is that tall?
I can't remember
Or
what
no,
the
wait.
name of it is.
You're talking about the Muties, right? Is that like
Yes.
the Muties? Okay.
Yeah,
I
there's
can't
a
remember.
short story in one of his collections. It's like he's in that town and he ends up getting hurt, and these witches kind of take him into their coven, and they're mending him back to health. But I can't
Ooh.
tell you any more about it.
Oh wow.
Because you have to read the story, and I love that story too. I just couldn't get into the series after a while because I have to agree with some people where it's like you kind of get to a point in the series where it's like, and then suddenly there's a bear with chainsaw hands.
Well, see, you know, what I've had to do with that, with the place that gave me the bad taste in my mouth, and maybe it shouldn't, because I guess it's happened in the past, but when I heard that he had written himself into it as himself, I'm like, you know, maybe there was some kind of cathartic thing he was doing, like after the van crash and all that kind of stuff, but the thought of that just made me think that someone somewhere told him that he was the Mark Twain of the 21st century, and he believed it. And then that's that's where that came about. But I mean, I'm probably judging too harshly. I really judge Stephen King harshly because of some of the stuff in the past that I've really connected with, and then stuff I think that, and it's sad. It really sucks because it just so happens to fall after his sobriety, where I'm just like,
yeah,
you know, you're going like Lizzy's story, I cannot stand. So it's like,
I couldn't get through that one either.
yeah. So, but before I get too far along, I missed this thread. TJ from Heckles and Horror, yeah, our horror film review show. He's asking if there is a website specifically or a link to purchase your work from.
So I have BrookeWarra.com, and I don't have a link to Vastarian up there yet, but that is available on Amazon. I'm in issue 1, volume 3.
And I'll go through
everything else is up there.
I'll go through the list. I'll go through some of the list at the end of the show, so I can reiterate that and people can look around for it. But yeah. TJ was also talking about. He said, "I feel like the mood you're in while writing really affects the outcome." He said, "You can tell that a writer had so much fun while writing. You can feel it. You can also tell the writer wasn't feeling it when reading certain things too. So it makes me wonder if that's kind of like contract." Obligations, and when sometimes that happens, you read that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, I feel like that is kind of a coin you flip in the air, because a lot of us will say, like, I work best under a deadline, and then
I think that I would
crunch time, and it's like, this feverish flurry of writing and it's so inspired or whatever. But then there are definitely those times where you put it off too long and you didn't outline it ahead of time, or you didn't plan anything for it, and you're kind of, maybe you've got other stuff going on, and you have to like kind of go to some emotional place and like drag the story out of yourself. And so I feel like waiting until that deadline is really pushing it, because you don't know if you're really going to get that inspired or if you're just going to be stressed out
But when
trying
you
to force this story. I think forcing anything in writing, it always comes across to the reader,
but
always.
but wouldn't you say that sometimes you can also find like a font of inspiration that way too? Almost like that quote,
Yeah.
like the prospect of being hanged like contracts the mind wonderfully or something like that, where you're under the gun, you might come up with something that you may have been too inhibited to do before.
No, totally. I've had it both ways, where it's like there's times I wait until the night before a deadline and 5,000 words come flying out and it's all really great and I'm happy with it. And then there's times I do that and the next morning I've got to turn it in and I'm like, oh, God, this is so forced. But more often than not, it's the kind of that thrilling, sort of inspiring feeling that you get waiting until the last minute.
Um, kind of on that tip a little bit, with Heirloom and the Dim Shores anthology, which Jennifer, you might be interested in this. I don't know if you're still around. Hopefully, you're still around, because the Dim Shores anthology was that Looming Low #1. That was actually nominated for the Shirley Jackson Award. So,
Yes.
I mean, that's gotta be good. That's gotta be fulfilling, knowing that you're at least nominated for an award named after Shirley Jackson.
Yeah. That was, I remember thinking when I first started out that I would set the Shirley Jackson Award as sort of like the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
And of course it was like this collaborative project, Sam Cowan and Justin Seal from, Justin's with Strange Eons now, but at the time they were putting this together for Dim Shores, and to find out, we were, as a collective, nominated for the Shirley Jackson, like, that was pretty incredible. I actually flew out to Boston
Whoa.
for the award ceremony.
Because you were coming from Arizona, right?
Actually, I'm up in the Northwest now.
But at that time,
You never know where I'm at.
No.
I was up here. I flew from here. I got married last year. So
well, I know
flew
that.
from here.
Actually, I meant to tell you congratulations on that.
Thank you. So my husband was near St. Louis. So I flew over there. We spent a few days together, and then he and I took a train to Chicago, and then from Chicago we flew to Boston for the awards were at ReaderCon this last summer.
Okay.
And that was just a really fun time. We got to spend 3 days in Boston. I got to see Gwendolyn Keist and Nadia Bolkin and John Langan, who wrote the Fisherman.
Okay.
I don't know if you've read that, but it is so good. It's totally meta. It's like a story within a story within a story, told, like, passed down through all these fishermen. It's really good.
I think I've at least heard of it.
I'm sure you have. It won a Stoker a couple of years ago.
Well, I tend to, and I've said this before, I don't know if this has like an elitist vein running through it or whatever, but most of the time, the more people nominate, or the more people rave about something in like a wide, in some sort of wide published thing, I usually avoid it. And then, like with House of Leaves, every I knew. See, every time I say House of Leaves to anyone who reads, they're always like, "Oh." And
that's like the only response.
And I have to admit that with that one, it ends up being such an experience that I think, kind of like putting it in that kind of vein, I think that ought to have its own realm. I think that saying that it kind of it sets this new standard for writing and stuff, I think that falls short. I think that with something like that, it's more of a puzzle, and it's more of a quest, and it's beyond readership. So when they say it's kind of like the greatest, this greatest mystery and all this kind of stuff, I kind of tune out slightly. And with something like that, I kind of wait for the hype to disappear, and then I I'll try it out because I'm afraid I don't
I
know.
tend to do that too. Honestly, a lot of the time I'll do that, and then everybody's talking about it, and I don't have anything to say, and then I'll finally get around to reading whatever everybody's all excited about.
So that
But I
would you?
definitely recommend. I think you would really love that book.
I know, and
I do.
I've been told that so many times because like I know just by looking at what it is and seeing what it is, I know that would be something that would it was so sumptuous to my character that I would totally eat my words, and I can't wait to do that. I cannot wait to be wrong, but I guess that I'm at a point where, especially with my own creating and stuff, I think that I would prefer not to even experience that until I get like a good, I don't know, until I can properly judge, I guess. But
Well, and if you're gonna read House of Leaves, it's like you got to block out a week.
I mean, do you really call it reading it?
It's right. It's kind of like you're studying.
Yeah, right. Which I don't mind
Yeah.
that. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I don't mind that at all. I love finding writers of the 18th century where I'm having to annotate or like find annotation or whatever. But it totally cracks me up that you were a victim to scholarly peer pressure, where you had to, in order to be able to like converse properly about the state of fiction and the framework of current writing and all that kind of stuff, and you haven't experienced it yet, so you have to go back home and crunch so you can
Well,
hang with the big
so
boys.
so it's true though, because like I'm writing horror, and I've been this last like year and a half or so like showing up at conventions and getting interviews here and there, and then it's like funny because people will bring up stuff like H.P. Lovecraft, and I'm like, I've honestly never read an H.P. Lovecraft story, and I know that people want to like excommunicate me from the horror community because I'm terrible about some of this stuff.
Well, I think that especially now, I wanted to reiterate, we're talking to Brooke Warra, a weird fiction and horror writer, about her accolades and her likes, dislikes, and her view. But I think that with, especially now, with I mean, I guess you could say that we're almost at the cliche end of Lovecraftian stuff. I think that it was virtually unknown for years. I mean, it was known for a long time, and then it was unknown, and then something, and a few people managed to bring it back into the light, and then all of a sudden, within the last, I'd say 15 years, maybe 20 years, it just exploded out of control where people were just like stapling tentacles to everything. And then
and it's cool though because like I still haven't ever read. I have a book of H.P. Lovecraft stories. I haven't gotten a chance to sit down and read it. To be honest, I'm reading a lot of new authors the last few years, so that's what I'm reading mostly. But I do enjoy Lovecraftian stories,
which can be great.
By people who aren't Lovecraft.
which can be great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's definitely one of those things where there's kind of there can be cliques that occur, and sometimes there ends up being a debate about what's Lovecraftian and what isn't. And with a lot of the Lovecraftian writers that don't talk about themselves as Lovecraftian writers, just kind of like I've always said that, with if you have a song, the more times I mean, this is of course like the genre is obvious, and I'm kind of subjected to it on the way to work. I carpool now, but the more someone says the word country in a song, the less country it becomes. So
right.
So that and all is kind of like with the Lovecraftian thing. But if you can manage to find that kind of like that tone and the thread, What is going on here? Jennifer is asking, who are you asking? How old are you? How all are, maybe she's speaking. I think she might be doing talk to text here. How old are you? How old are all of us? What does that matter? Are 65-year-olds reading modern horror? I don't know what she's talking about.
Oh, yeah. I just want to really quick recommend to you
Oh, I see what she's saying.
Star Creek by Nathan Carson, which is like, I don't think I've ever heard him actually call himself Lovecraftian, but he wrote this novella called Star Creek, and it's like Lovecraft.
If I
but
may,
with like
if
sex,
I may,
drugs and rock and roll, and it's raunchy and fun and amazing.
I think that definitely the title there, I think that says it all, where he managed to find a title where he's thinking of the backwoods and the cosmos at the same time. So
Yeah.
Star Creek has that in a nutshell. So, but if you're saying that
it's
kind of like this modern bent,
all like it takes place kind of in the backwoods of the state of Oregon. So I already loved it because it's like takes place in the Pacific Northwest, and I don't want to tell you too much about it, but I read it about a year ago, and I think I might have even texted you about like, you got to read this book. It's super fun. It's a novella, so it's like totally a one night read. But he's awesome, and I'm excited for anything else he's doing. But I know that music is really his big thing, so he's not putting out a lot of fiction because he works with his band and everything. But
what's the name of the
Star
band?
Creek, I can't remember the name of his band, and I should totally know that.
Okay. Well, but the Lovecraftian thing, I spoke my first podcast back. I ended up talking about a study in Emerald by Neil Gaiman, where it's Sherlock Holmes era Lovecraftian story, and it is so wonderful. It totally tricked me. It completely tricked me. And there's nothing I love more. It's so funny. I was looking around and Mel was like, "What are you grinning like an idiot for?" And I was like, "I totally got roped in and completely bamboozled by this story." I was so happy. There's nothing I love more, especially since in this, like, there's an unreliable narrator, but he doesn't mean to be unreliable. But that's the thing, though. It was a graphic novel version of it with fantastic art, and the best part is that somehow it managed to be unreliable, but it didn't know it was unreliable because it wasn't trying to trick you. It was all of your own assumptions as kind of like a Sherlockian fan while reading it, and then based in kind of like this Lovecraftian world. And at the end, I was totally wrong. I was completely wrong, and I couldn't have been happier to be wrong, because there's nothing that shows mastery more than someone who reads so much of both genres that you're going for, and I totally got taken to the cleaners. I was so happy.
Yeah, I love it when that happens. I think especially if you're an avid reader, it's like you can kind of you get a little bit, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I get a little bit too big for my britches, I guess, and I'm like, I got this all figured out, and then they surprise me.
Yeah.
It's such a treat.
It's awesome. Tell me about the Wicked Library podcast.
The Wicked Library is amazing people. So that is run by Dan Foytik, who also produces The List. And I think Nelson Piles is also a producer on the Wicked Library, and it's essentially a showcase for horror writers. So they are great in the way that they will accept stories that have already been published. So,
that's rare. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's kind of an awesome thing to kind of be able to, they'll get a hold of me every now and then. They're like, "What do you got for us?" And I can send them something that was maybe published 4 years ago, and it gets a whole new audience. And like I said, they do the podcast with the music and the actors, and they just, I think it was the Halloween special this year. They they did in their anthology episode. Do you remember the twisted tale of Vernon? The twisted end of Vernon Boggs. I don't even know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So they have a character on the Wicked Library called the Librarian, and he's very much a Tales from the Crypt Keeper style character, and he will every once in a while read one of the stories on the Wicked Library. Not every time, but every once in a while. And he narrated the twisted end of Vernon Boggs, and it was so much fun.
Oh, I bet that was
to.
awesome. I bet that was awesome.
Yes. So, I mean, I guess I should, because you know what I'm talking about. This story, for people who don't know, was about a shut-in whose property has been bought out. It's kind of vague. Basically, they're putting a freeway through where he lives, and so he, in protest, like, essentially trudges out into the woods, and he's going to lay down in the moss and the muck and not be moved again.
Yeah.
And I think, looking back, I'm like, because you know, like, there was like 3 years that I spent like not leaving my house.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually got over that, and now I'm out in the world and out and about all the time. But I think when I was writing that, I was kind of working through some of that. But it was also like really visually a fun story to write. But in the end there, for your listeners, Vernon is enchanted by the forest, and the forest turns him into a tree. And it's very graphic and violent in the end.
You know, it's interesting that you use the word enchanted, because to me that has such a lilting. That's such a bright. Like, to me, the word enchanted rarely has a dark intonation.
Right,
So it's really.
I could probably say he's cursed.
but I don't know. I think that kind of goes along the lines of. I was thinking of really, really great villains in horror history and different kind of fantastical history. And I saw a video of the best lines, of Pinhead's best lines, and he said, demons to some, angels to others. So I think that's kind of the same thing with the enchantment, where it's like you could call it a curse, and that has some of the aspect to it, but is that his point of view? Does he feel? I mean, if you walked into the woods and all of a sudden the woods they were actually trying to become part of your transcendence or whatever, like, would that be enchantment then? But from the outside looking in, it would definitely appear to be a curse. So I think that's
right, because
it's all there.
Like this horrible, like, painful transformation that happens, but in a way, he gets exactly what he wants. He doesn't want to be moved anymore. So I guess it just depends on perspective.
And it could be even like parts of your life. I was talking to someone, and I think we were talking about movies at the time, but the same thing goes for books and stories as well. James is asking about the Vernon Boggs story. Is that in the Lift book?
No, actually, the Lift book that they just released is so all the pretty much, I think, everybody's the original writers, and we all wrote brand new stories.
Cool.
My story in that book is called Brother's Keeper, and it's essentially a sordid tale of two brothers that have a lot of animosity between the two of them, and they get caught up with Victoria in the building, and all these family secrets come out.
And I think that's kind of like a galvanizing thing when you start going into like familiar things, and I think that can make for a lot of interesting reading.
Yeah. I write a lot about kind of, especially like family relationships lately. I think because I moved home to my hometown a year and a half ago, and I hadn't been here in like 20 years. And it's absolutely gorgeous here. I'm in like the southernmost part of Washington State, right on the Columbia River. so just across the river from the state of Oregon. And it's
So you've got
gorgeous
it all.
there. Yeah. But I'm also living in my childhood home, and it's wonderful here, and I'm spending a lot of time with my dad, and it's awesome. But there's also a lot of my fiction the last year and a half has had a lot to do with, family and those relationships and how they can become strained, or, and a lot of times it's kind of a hard place to go to, especially since my father and my mom are usually like the first people to read what I write. And sometimes I'm like, wait, let me explain first.
You got to roll out the disclaimers because somehow, Aunt Millie has ended up in the story somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I guess one question that I had was, what separates the Wicked Library from the Lift? Are they the same type of thing? Or are they both kind of like the dramatized versions of these stories? Is one like in only audio form and the other one is like animated or something?
No, so they're both podcasts, and they're both produced by Ninth Story Studios.
Okay.
Now the Wicked Library is just kind of an author showcase. They do all kinds of stories. Sometimes an episode will be 2 stories by the same author, or 6 stories by 6 different authors, and they're just very good at getting your work out there and promoting the writers. And The Lift is actually a series that all takes place in the same universe. And the idea is there's this building that's kind of a magical building that appears in front of somebody when they're facing some sort of critical choice that they have to make between whatever, like they've done something, and they can either make it right or they're stuck in the building forever. And Victoria is the little girl that haunts the building.
Okay, so
kind of leads people.
So when you're talking about the sordid tale of 2 brothers, Victoria is the ghost, or whatever you'd call her, the kind of like the crux of the stories in The Lift. Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So it would be just sort of like a Twilight Zone. The Lift is kind of like the Twilight Zone if Rod Serling was Victoria and actually interacted with everybody that entered the Twilight Zone. So that's what The Lift is like.
That actually reminds me a little bit of I interacted with Dirt Candy Productions at the last Midwest Horror Fest in October, and they have a guy. It's really crazy. You could have almost written this character. His name is Alfie, and they kind of refer to him as the Creep, and he's had 2 films in which he's kind of like the antagonist, but to call him a villain I think that's short shrift. He's probably one of the most interesting. It's so difficult to call him an antagonist, but I guess you have to call him an antagonist. She Was So Pretty 1 and She Was So Pretty 2, Be Good for Goodness Sake, and then they're kind of like putting him in the next film as in between that. It's kind of in between Victoria and Rod Serling, where he doesn't quite interact with the people, but he doesn't quite comment on it either, and you always see him kind of like weaving his way through the stories that are going to be in the upcoming film Tales from the Creep. So it's kind of
really cool.
Yeah, so it's kind of that same flavor there. But I guess another thing I wanted to ask was we've been blowing through a lot of these accolades and stuff, but before I forgot, I definitely wanted to find out how you feel about one of your stories being nominated for the Pushcart Prize. That's pretty heavy.
Yeah. So that story was, I feel better now, from Vastarian. And like I said earlier, I was sort of, when it got published, and this was just a couple of weeks ago, I was like panicking, like, now people are going to read this. I mean, it's so incredibly personal, and I'm not sure how people are going to respond to it. And then a few days later, the editor messages me, and he's like, I just want to tell you before it gets announced that we're nominating I Feel Better Now for the Pushcart Prize. And I'm telling
Wow.
you, I just about fell over. I think I did fall over. That is something I never even entertained the idea that anything I wrote would be nominated for something like that. And a lot of people get nominated. So the Pushcart Prize has been around since the 70s, and it's an award for short fiction and poetry from small presses. And editors can each nominate, I think there's like a limit, a certain number of stories or poems that they've published that they can
Okay, I see.
nominate for this award. And then I think we don't find out until May of next year who the winners are. And I'm actually not even worried about it because I'm just so excited that somebody felt like that story deserved to be nominated. Like, that's just huge. I'm kind of still like, I don't even know how to process it. It's cool. It's really cool.
And I think that's the best way to be. I mean, if you think that, or even if you don't think that you're going to win something, it seems like if you're nominated and you just kind of like forget or like move on and start doing other stuff, I don't necessarily think that you're more likely to win, but it seems like it does kind of skew that direction. If you agonize over something and you really worry about it, then it almost seems like it wouldn't possibly happen. But if you just kind of like,
it just does seem like that's kind of how the universe likes to play things.
If you just kind of set it aside,
honestly, like, just totally. I just think even a nomination for these kinds of things is just, that's how much better does it get,
Oh yeah,
really
now you can.
Cool.
Can you kind of like tag that on? I mean, I suppose that like especially with films, you can say that you've been nominated for an Oscar. You can say that for the rest of your life. I've seen people where it'll say like it'll say the description of a movie and it'll show the actor's name and there's an asterisk, and at the bottom of the thing
it's
it
so
says.
Funny though too, because like in the like the writing community, it's like I have friends who have been nominated for Stoker's or even like won Stoker Awards, and then they're like, I don't know if I should say that in my bio. It feels weird. And I'm like, dude, you like got nominated for a Stoker.
Yeah, I mean,
I just think it's weird. It kind of like people sort of want to apologize for promoting themselves, and it's like, that's your job, man. That's your job as a writer.
I mean, I've never heard of anyone like saying that they weren't nominated for an Eisner or a Hugo or anything like that. I mean, you have to. I mean, it's not you saying it yourself. It's a juried group. Like,
right.
They're curating. So like you get kind of shuffled in under that kind of stuff. And in this case, you were nominated by someone that had to do with the journal and stuff, and that journal's available on Amazon, by the way. Volume 1, Issue 3 of Vasterian, a literary journal, for the I Feel Better Now Pushcart Prize nominated story. I Feel Better Now. That should always
mouthful.
that should preface that every single time where someone says, "Hey, what about your, didn't you get a story published?" You'd be like, "Yeah, my Pushcart Prize nominated story. I feel better now." You got to do it. I don't know.
I just need like a recording of you saying that, then I can just play that.
Yeah, just
every
like
time
you could have that.
Tell somebody about the story.
Whatever that contraption was that the McAllister kid in Home Alone had, Talk Boy. If you had a Talk Boy, and then you could constantly just like play that. But
it's totally Home Alone season right now.
I haven't seen that movie. I don't think I've seen that movie in 5 years or so.
Oh man, why? It's like the Christmas movie.
I keep hearing that Better Watch Out is like the horror version of Home Alone.
Oh really? I haven't even heard of that one.
I think it's about like two kids or they're like babysat or something like that, and then there's like a home invader or whatever, and then they kind of like fend for themselves or whatever. And I heard it has a
I
real.
gotta check that out for sure.
I heard it got a real tongue in cheek view to it and stuff. So, but I haven't seen that one yet. I'm looking forward to it, but. I almost always end up talking about movies, but I guess they're kind of hand in hand, sort of. I'm
No,
not
they
sure.
are. I mean, I think it's kind of funny because I don't think it's just me. I think a lot of horror writers, especially in like my age group, where like we grew up in the 80s, you know, and if you ask, you know, horror writers in this generation, like what were your biggest influences? So many of those influences are going to be film.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, our children's viewing in the 80s was so dark. Like, I watched The Never-Ending Story last night.
Oh,
Before I
yeah.
went to bed. And
These
more or less,
hands. These
the turtle
hands.
thing, oh, God. Yes, these hands. Oh, my God.
Yeah,
It's just
I see memes of the turtle head all the time. And you know, I can't remember wasn't the turtle just saying like, oh, well, I'll probably just die here, or something like that, you know. I guess that's kind of like...
It's totally nonchalant about its own demise.
I've lived for
It wants to die.
25,000 years. But then again, I mean, Artex, right?
Oh, man, it's like every kid's heart in the whole world all broke simultaneously.
But I'm actually kind of curious as to see if that kind of emotional depth kind of resonates still. Like I don't think we've watched Neverending Story with Lucy yet, but I would like to think she's got a pretty deep emotional depth. I would like to think that she would probably cry at the horse. She'd probably cry at the
You're
kid.
I'd really like to see this little kid cry.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you kind of have to, because
it's a staple of childhood too. She totally needs to see it. It's a great movie.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, especially since like I brought The Princess Bride into their lives for the first time ever in their lives. I was like, what is happening?
Crazy.
What is happening? But I think that sometimes, kind of like with the disillusion of like the HBO after school type of deal, I think that since that's kind of gone by the wayside, because I mean it was in rotation, like all kinds of stuff, Monster Squad. There was all types of stuff that was playing just nonstop, constantly, that I was able to see, and now there's so many options that
there's a lot.
There's so many options that very rarely is anything ever paid attention to. I mean, I
gotta tell you though, I had this like, you know how sometimes you'll kind of remember something from childhood and you're like, was that real or like some weird fever dream that I had? You know, because it's so bizarre that you're like, there's no way that was a kid's movie. Well, I kept talking about this cartoon that really messed me up as a kid, and I couldn't remember exactly what about it was so horrifying.
Oh God, I have to know.
And my husband was like, it's Unico, the unicorn from like 1983, I think, or something. You can actually find it on YouTube, I think, now. And I'm not sure where else you can get a hold of these movies, but...
You still there?
I'm still hearing her.
We're freezing up on the internet.
Oh, we're freezing up. Where do you think we got lost? I mentioned Artex, the whole thing goes to shit.
We just opened an emotional vortex.
What's
what
that now?
happened?
We're gonna check and see what the
Okay.
episode is doing.
Yeah, Andrew's gonna run upstairs and make
I
sure.
don't know how you're still talking to her if the internet's down or whatever.
Yeah, no kidding, right? But just in case anyone can hear us, I'm not even sure now. But
I don't know, but you have to go back and like revisit Unico, and you might not know what I'm talking about because it's so obscure. But like Unico the unicorn, and I would suggest you view it before you introduce Lucy to it.
Is it like
it is messed up?
It's like mind melting.
Yeah, it's like this. It's like early '80s kind of anime, full movie length cartoon out of I can't remember which part of Asia, but it is.
Wait a second.
I'm pretty sure it's Japanese.
Wait a second. Are you sure you're not referring to The Last Unicorn?
No, I know The Last Unicorn because I watch that all the time. This is Unico the Unicorn, and it is really bizarre, super creepy, the scariest villain you've ever seen in a children's movie.
We might be back. Do I have to share again? Huh? Am I sharing again?
No, we never lost.
Okay, cool. If in case someone got a little dip in the audio, or both, I don't know. You're probably happy to get my ugly face off of everything, but with the. We are speaking with Brooke Warra, weird fiction horror writer. She has been nominated for the the Pushcart Prize for her story "I Feel Better Now." Now available in Volume 1, Issue 3 of Vastarian, a literary journal, available at Amazon. But we're talking about the fabulous adventure, the fantastic adventures of Unico, and I am not familiar, but this doesn't even remotely look like a horse.
Oh, you have to watch it, though. It is the most bizarre, I don't know any other word to use for it other than traumatizing, because I think I saw that movie once when I was 4.
Okay, I just came across...
I'm 38 now.
I just came across an article.
Fever dreams about this.
I just came across an article that states Unico, no question, is the most horrifying children's movie ever made.
They are not wrong.
Holy shit. It says no movie can compete on a sheer terror scale with the animated movies of Unico.
You have to watch it and just envision yourself, as a young child.
Andrew, see if you can't get a text that says sold above my head when I'm talking about Unico, the most terrifying. I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. But oh my God. So would you say, you were talking about kind of like the 80s and how it was a real dark. But see, that's the thing, though. I think that I was reading kind of like the dark histories of. I was reading Bruno Bettelheim. He wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment. And it's kind of like an analysis of fairy stories and stuff. Totally fantastic.
Ooh, I gotta pick that up.
Yeah, it's kind of a major book. Like it's usually in like college courses when they're going through that kind of analysis, they have that book. And there's another one. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll see if I can't find it and send you to it. But it's also about kind of like the importance of anthropomorphic animals and fairy tales and stuff. But basically, the Uses of Enchantment was talking about like the stuff in fairy tales that have been kind of like sanitized out of it, and how like the dark consequences kind of they instill things. So if you have these 80s movies, like I would find it hard to believe that my God, you think about Neverending Story, and like I remember my first turn on as a kid was the Southern Oracle.
Yeah.
Because I was like, are you kidding me right now? So it's like, I think that kids are, I think we really super sanitize and sterilize for kids. And there's a fear that they're not going to be able to understand correctly, and then they're going to get twisted or something. And I think that we.
Look at how we turned out, though.
But I think that. Wait a second. Are you saying that kids should? Are you saying that kids?
No, I'm totally joking.
I was about to say. Are you saying that kids should be fantastically awesome?
My kids were like 6 and 11 when I sat them down to watch the claymation movie, The Adventures of Mark Twain. And
how are you finding all these terrifying things?
That was on Netflix for a little while.
Huh.
And I was like, oh, man, you guys need to sit down and watch this. And we're like halfway through the movie, and there's like a scene where like Satan is just a floating face, and he's talking about like the creation of humans and his own damnation. And then there's like another scene where it's like
Mark
this is
Twain?
claymation. Yeah, that's what's weird about this movie, okay? Because you kind of aren't sure exactly what it has to do with Mark Twain, except that he does play a character. There is a character that's Mark Twain in the movie. There's a couple of his short stories that are depicted, but a lot of it is really dark and actually horrifying. So I'm like halfway through this movie with my kids, and they're like 6 and 11, I think.
Good Lord.
Maybe 7 and 12. And they're like, why are we watching this? And I was like, look, my dad sat me down in front of this movie. And it came out in the 70s before I was born. So, like, he knew full well that it was going to, like, warp me.
Or put you
I'm
on the
like,
right
and
path.
now I'm passing that on
Yeah.
to you.
You got to pass
And they
on the
actually
warp.
loved it. It's dark and it's weird and it's bizarre, but they like the movie. It's very strange.
I mean, the other night, there's no doubt about it. We were doing, what the hell are we doing? It seems like we were doing, maybe it was Thanksgiving? It seems like we were giving out presents, though. I don't know what happened. I always get I get all these holidays screwed up. But all the kids were there, and somehow The Wizard of Oz was on, and it had been a long time since I had seen it. So we watched that, and after it was all over, I was like, you two have got to see Return to Oz.
Yes.
And she was like, what the hell's that? And I was like, it is the darkest Dorothy story that's ever existed, and it is completely awesome. Everyone should watch Return to Oz. I got this big clamshell VHS version of it, and it's just like wonderful. So, but yeah.
That's a good one. That one's definitely in my Amazon library that I'm like collecting the world's best movie collection. I just recently added the Twilight Zone movie. Very proud of that.
I have to say that that is I think kind of beyond what anyone could have ever guessed, especially in my case. That completely tears my guts apart when I watch that movie. The kick the can is just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
It's like, how about stab the shit out of my feels while you're at it?
It really is. And I think that's kind of goes back to like I think we were talking about like current horror writers, or a lot of the influence came from like the film and movies of that era. And a lot of it is about, it's pretty serious stuff, like our own, fear of our own mortality, or even just aging, or being abandoned. Like there's a lot of heavy topics that get dealt with in those movies.
Well, I mean,
and then it's not just horrifying. Like there is a lot of magic that happens in those films, and I think it was heavily influential on an entire generation of artists.
Well, I think that things kind of like stick out, and you start picking up threads because, like, I hadn't told you about this yet, but the reason why I was off the podcast and I was out of the bookshop and I was hiding under my covers, my mom passed away in October 15th or something like that, just out of Nowheresville. So, like, now when I'm watching stuff, I just see cremation and everything. I guess it's kind of like the same. It's the same thing where, like, you go through a breakup, and then every single damn song that's everywhere is all about you just see love everywhere. So it's kind of the same thing. But in that same vein, like how we're talking about like the 80s influence and stuff, how do you think this kind of like pseudo 80s revival stuff, like the Stranger Things aspect, and it seems like summer of '84 that movie's came out, and I'm really interested in seeing that, where they're kind of like distilling the flavor of the '80s onto, but kind of like seen through the lens of like modern sensibilities and stuff. Like, do you think any of that is gonna influence? Do you think it'll influence in the same way, or do you think it'll be tempered in a 21st century vein?
I think it's nostalgia, so it is tempered, I think, and that's fine. Because I think what's coming out of that a lot is, like my kids' generation is now interested in all these things like that came out of that era. And that's just really fun to like share with them. So I think it's kind of renewing like an interest, but it is, it's kind of funny. Sometimes you'll be watching something that's, very nostalgic of the 80s and you're kind of like, were we really that nerdy? Were we really all in bright red corduroy pants and
Well,
brown
I have to
sweaters?
say that I've definitely seen evidence of it. Like, especially, I think where you normally see that is in like if ever you're like watching a Stranger Things or you're watching some old '80s flick and you wonder, like Valley Girl or something, and you wonder if all that stuff was real. Go to the library and go to the archives and look in any yearbook from that era, and you'll see all
Right.
of that stuff. So I think that it's important to bring that back. It's interesting to note that, um, especially since now, like with the advent of social media and stuff, I think knowing that your kids are never going to experience this same nostalgia the way you have, there are going to be things that you latched on and things that they like when they lay their experiences on top of that. It almost makes me wonder sometimes if it's purely stylistic, if they're ever going to be able to relate to it. I mean, except when it comes to like the children's relationships with each other and their parents and their world and all that kind of stuff. It seems like specific, like every once in a while I'll watch something that's in this kind of like nostalgic vein, and the damn deja vu or whatever you would call that feeling where it hits so close to a home that you haven't seen in 30
Yeah.
years that you're just like, I don't know how to reconcile this. It's just so weird that you're feeling all this stuff once again. I wonder if it'll ever have as much meaning to
I
them.
don't I don't think so. I think it's neat to kind of experience this like in our own age group, like we're all collectively sort of looking back and remembering and like like you said earlier, um, Stephen King, if it wasn't for how horrific and strange and mystical childhood is, I don't know where a lot of really good horror would come from. So for us, it's like, we're remembering our own childhood, and then I think for the kids, it's like maybe it's a really good movie or it's a good show,
Yeah, I
but
suppose. I suppose.
it's not quite the same emotional. Like there's a lot of times where I'm like, I get really excited about some nostalgic thing in a movie, even like the newer ones that are, you know, set in the 80s or whatever, and the kids are just like, whatever. Like you guys don't even have the internet.
Well, I think that now especially, and this is something that it would just like destroy my brains if I even thought about it that much. But if you think about it, it was the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and then you have like the resurgence of the 70s, and you have the resurgence of the 60s, like in fashion and music, and you have these resurgences and stuff, and then you have these places and these kind of like these artisans and stuff that are making just like on Etsy and their own little shops and Teespring and stuff. You have everything now. The 21st century is all of the generations and all of the eras existing at once, because if you're a 60-year-old and you want something, some jacket that you wore or some car that you had or some bubble gum that you chewed that went away, you can have it. If you
Yeah.
you can have anything all at once. So you'll see like these Funko Pops, and you'll see some kind of character from some movie, and you're like, wait a minute, I kind of half remember that. But someone who's been thinking about wanting a figure of that guy since the beginning of time. So now everyone can have it and everyone can experience it. So like when the kids who existed in the aughts, they may think that Back to the Future was theirs.
Right.
They may think, American Graffiti was theirs, or they may think or whatever. We were talking about remakes and successful remakes. I went into and this kid is kind of along that thread. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I meant to mention it earlier. I was so terrified that I was going to go into it thinking about Tim Curry the whole time, and it was going to completely ruin my my take of it. And the group that I went with, it just so happened that it was when it came out, and the place was just packed to the rafters. And I think that kind of goes along with that. Like, where was this, interest coming from? And it makes me think they have one faction of people who saw it on television and read the book, and then you've got this new horror file group, and then you've got a group of people who want to see it because the kids are slightly within their age range and they might relate to it. So the whole place was like packed to the gills, and I couldn't sit with my group. I ended up having to sit to the side, and and in my peripheral vision, I could see them like staring me down to see what my take was going to be, because I was so damn skeptical. And it turned out totally as a surprise to me that I didn't think of Tim Curry one time due to the performance of Bill Skarsgård. So like in that case, I think that it was a triumph. So like in that case, in that remake, I think it was a definite win. But I've had people totally disagree with me on that too. But
yeah, I actually love the new It, and I think we've talked about this before. In fact, I'm sure that we have. I, of course, grew up with the television miniseries.
Yeah.
But as much as I love Tim Curry, I've always kind of not liked that movie.
Yeah.
Because so I didn't read it when I was 11 years old when the miniseries came out, but later on in life, I think I was about 20 by the time I picked it up. That book is so incredibly dark, and they could never do it justice in the early 90s made for television. There was just no way. And I think it's still, it's a fun movie. It's exactly what it was meant to be. And of course there's like Jonathan Brandis and Seth Green, and when I rewatch it, it's kind of nostalgic.
That's really cool that you brought back kind of like for some reason when I think of it, I think of John Ritter. I don't think of the kids.
Yeah, he's in there too.
But when you bring up the kids, then all of a sudden that does come flooding back that Brandis is there, and it's especially chilling when you think that he took his own life.
Yeah.
So it's it's really something.
Well, and that's another thing too. Like it's there's so much darkness even surrounding like anything about that story. And then so I was totally stoked for the remake. It did not disappoint. There is a part of me that's like, I wish that they had gone a little bit darker. But we're still waiting on the second half.
I think they might make up for it there.
Yeah, because I think you can only go so dark with, a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old kids on the screen, like, as far as mainstream audiences go. But what the heck was up with, I don't want to spoil anything for people.
Okay, before we go any further, if for some reason you're listening to a podcast about books and somehow you haven't seen the new movie about it, something's going to get spoiled here. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but number one, shame on you, and number two, let's go.
Okay, so the kid, Henry Bowers.
Yeah.
What the heck with them killing him off, seemingly, at least, in the end of the first movie installment, the new one? I'm like, how are they? Because that plays in later.
Wait
So,
a
I mean, a little-
second. Wait a second. Wait a second. I don't remember him getting killed in that movie.
Yeah, okay, so like the last time they go into the house and the well that kind of leads to the underworld.
Oh
where
shit!
it
You mean
comes
him falling down
from.
the well? When he falls down the
Yeah.
well?
Yeah, and I think they actually even show that like he dies. And in the movie theater, I was like, what is going on? Because that plays so heavily into events that happen later.
You know, I haven't seen the remake in a minute, but I was thinking that when he's kind of being like, is he being talked to like at his dad's house, like when he comes outside and he's just standing there? I thought that was the end.
No. That's
Do you remember?
before.
Do you remember the end of it?
Yeah.
Did
Did he fall down the well and die?
I was thinking that Henry, is it Brower or I thought it was Brower, right?
Bauer.
Oh, Bauer. Okay, I'm getting him mixed up with the kid in the body. And Stand By Me. But so the part when with his dad, and then he walks outside, and then it's kind of almost like he's getting talked to on the wind or something. He's like standing out there by the car.
Yeah, and he goes kind of catatonic, and
That
that's
wasn't the end of him.
No, that wasn't the end of his storyline. There, that's kind of when he snaps and he goes after the kids, and so he ends up in the house with them, and then he dies.
So
but I don't know if they're like bringing him back as a ghost later or what, because that can't be the end of his story. That would be nuts.
But see, I was kind of tempted to say, well, couldn't Pennywise just kind of like resurrect him? But then I was saying, wait, there's like a huge span of time where he's in the insane asylum, right?
Right, like 27 years. So that's where I'm like, I don't know. I'm just really mostly curious as to what direction they're taking that, because, you know, in the book and in the original film, he, like you said, he's in the insane asylum or prison, and he spent his whole life now like wanting to get revenge on these kids for basically what they did to him, and then Pennywise helps him like break out, and so I'm just curious, like they kill him off as a kid in the first remake. I just want to know how that plays out, but we have to wait until like, when's the next installment coming out?
Oh my god, I don't even know. I think it's supposed to be next year.
Yeah, I think it's September.
I thought I read something where like everything is coming out in 2019. It's gonna be like one of the biggest years of film.
That's exciting. This last year has been pretty amazing.
Oh,
I don't know
it was
if you saw, did you see Annihilation?
Okay. Before you say anything about Annihilation, I bought the Area X trilogy.
Yeah.
And that was way super before the movie was announced. So
yeah,
I hadn't started. It was on my to be read pile for like a year, and you know how that can be. So then I saw the announcement for the film, and I was like, "Fuck, I can't read the books."
What?
Because I can't remember how you fell on the movie pre-book or the book pre-movie, but I'm all about the movie pre-book. So, because I always think that a book will expand a story or will enhance a story, and a movie contracts a story. So if you start out with the movie, then the book can only enhance it. So when I saw that the announcement had been made, especially since it was done by Ex Machina director, I was like, I gotta watch the movie first. So then I bought the movie, and now the movie's on my to be watched pile. So I got the to be watched pile Annihilation, and I've got the Area X pile. So
I'm just gonna say it's really good.
The movie?
It's really good. Yeah, I probably watch it at least once a month since it came out.
Whoa, that's major. And especially since
It's really good.
I think it's one of those things where it doesn't, like, the importance of the story doesn't hinge on the fact that it's, I mean, saying predominantly female doesn't even cover it. I mean, it's massively female. But
Yeah.
it's not one of those things where, like, that's the tagline. It's just, it's just an incidental
which
part.
I think that's like really important too.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up actually, because I think inclusiveness shouldn't be all about, like you said, the tagline, like all female cast. It should just be what it is. And they do a really good job with that.
I think we have to learn that.
That movie, like, you're like feeling like they specifically made this as a female-led female cast. It just feels really more authentic.
And I think that despite kind of like they're screaming it to the contrary, screaming to the contrary, I think that may have been one of the factors that doomed Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
I think that was such, it was so screamingly that, I think that, I mean, despite the other problems with it, I haven't even watched it, but.
Well, I just know, like, because female horror writers, we talk about this a lot, and it's like, I don't want to be the token woman.
Yeah.
And I think even as a group, we're like, just let it be a movie, like, that's more, I think it's really important that, opportunities for women as, artists and writers and, directors and just all of it is, I think those need to be created and pushed forward more, because we are working toward this kind of, like, as a society that we're not going to leave people behind or leave people out. But I think, the best way I know how to describe it is the Coven season of American Horror Story.
Okay.
They have,
don't get me wrong, I'm not totally, are you talking about Precious?
No, actually, I was going to bring up the actress. I always forget her name, which is so horrible right now.
It's really bad, but I hate her face. I cannot stand Precious. I just hate her face.
I'm not talking about her, though, but the actress with Down syndrome. She is a character in Coven, and it's never brought up that she's disabled. She just is a character on the show. She is an actress with a disability on the show. And when I saw that season, I'm not even a big fan of that season, really. It's not my favorite American Horror Story season, but it's one of my favorites just because I got so excited that they were like, they had this female character. She's, visibly disabled. And then it's not what her character is about. And I think that's kind of how I feel about any kind of inclusiveness. Like just the point is not that we are the token. The point is that we're just there to do our job.
Sure.
You see what I'm saying? It's like
Harlan Ellison.
A different feeling.
Harlan Ellison actually, he came out, and I think it may have been in his Harlan Ellison's Watching article or something, and he basically talked about how he had done some sort of article or some talking piece about how there was this strange bias where I'm trying to remember exactly what had happened, but basically there were female science fiction writers who were coming out and saying, I don't want my work to be kind of like shuffled in and not given a true review of any kind, just to satisfy this quota from the female spectrum of the science fiction writing community, where she was like, and she was totally mentioning names. She was kind of like Anne McCaffrey releases some book where it's like Anne McCaffrey presents such and such a name, and then after a little while, then that name presents such and such a name, and then it becomes one of these things where it became kind of like the sewing circle thing, and she was just like, I want to run with the boys because I'm a writer and not because I'm a woman. And it ought to be writers across the board, whether like whatever you are, it ought to be writers only. And he got on a lot of shit about that, and then it turned out that for as much shit that he got, he ended up getting a lot more passionate, heartfelt letters from anonymous female writers of the science fiction and horror community, where they were like, thank you so much for kind of like being honest about the hypocrisy and about kind of like the bullshit of, I mean, they weren't really using inclusion like we are now, but basically whatever language that would kind of like put that across. And I think that,
and it is kind of like, it is sort of it's a kind of a difficult thing to navigate too, because there are, at least I've noticed in the last few years, that a lot of the new up-and-coming, like, horror and science fiction writers, there is kind of a distinctive difference in their style or voice. And so I do think that there needs to be opportunities created. But at the same time, not just, like you said, like, well, we're going to publish this because it's written by a woman and we need 4 women in this anthology.
Yeah.
At least, like, that's, nobody wants to be that. As a writer, I don't know any writer that's like, yeah, that sounds good. We want to be included because we work at this and it's our job and we pour our hearts into it, and just like anybody does. But I think that what I've noticed is sometimes it's not so much we don't like female writers. It's these new voices, these new perspectives are sometimes people want to stick with the styles and the voices that they know, and like this familiar familiar narratives, rather than kind of being adventurous and hearing from like people of color and women and people with disabilities and those perspectives, because the story's going to be a little bit different because we have a different experience.
I think that there ought to be maybe there ought to be sort of like tiers or like windows where you have this, I mean, like, especially now, since it's kind of become kind of like the touchstone of just the way we do things now, or at least try to do things now. There ought to be something where it's like, okay, well, you want to give exposure a name. You want to kind of like have it loud enough for you to hear, but not so loud that it ends up becoming like an insult or whatever.
Right.
But then there should be a window where that ceases, where it's like, okay, well, for a long time, every time we put this author on something, it would say something like female New York Times best-selling author. It's like, after 5 years, let's cut the female off.
Right. And that's, I think, what everybody wants is like, we're writers, we're artists, we're poets, and instead of having to like, because I think when you keep adding that, then it's like you're still putting me in a box. You know what I mean? You're still putting me in my place.
And it's getting smaller and smaller.
What's so frustrating.
I
think the best way I've seen it handled, just personally, the best way I've seen it handled is one of the anthologies that I've worked with in the last couple of years. They felt like they didn't have enough diversity in their authors. So what they did for one of their issues was they reached out to women, people of color, just all these from different communities, and then they did a blind reading.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, yeah, and I think that's probably the best way.
And that was what I was going to mention, yeah.
Because then you're welcoming, because I think a lot of times if you're in this, like, marginalized group and you look at a certain market and you're like, they're not going to want, I might feel like that market doesn't want to hear my story. But then if they reach out to me and they're like, hey, actually, we'd really love to hear something from you. And then after that, they're blind reading, but they know they have women. Mm-hmm. They know they have marginalized groups in that pile of stories, and they know that, like, chances are when they end up voting on it, they're going to have a really good mix of people. And it ended up working out really well. So I think that's probably one of the better experiences that I've had as far as, like, being asked because, they wanted to hear new voices. They wanted to hear from people that were kind of struggling to, be included. And then at the same time, our work had to speak for itself.
I think the meritocratic, or the meritocratic rather, I think that's the way to go. It's like if you have everything in a brown paper cover and you read through that thing and there's no at least amount of bias as you can possibly have. Anyway, I mean, if for some reason I think it seems to me like you'd have to be a hell of an editor to recognize someone's writing style without having any foreknowledge of who it would have been. But at least in that way, that's great. I think that ought to be implemented with practically everything that has to do with any kind of application at all, anywhere, with anything.
Yeah.
I think that's the way.
Yeah, I'm all for, like, blind reading, but I think the kind of, like, the editors being vocal about, like, hey, we want to hear from everybody. That was what made all the difference. And then getting into that anthology was like, an actual, felt like a success rather than somebody like, hey, I need a disabled female writer.
which I have seen. I have absolutely seen open calls for that type of thing. I've seen open calls like that. And it's funny because, I mean, being a white heterosexual male, like me looking at that and I'm going, oh, okay. It's not like I feel some kind of knife in my gut because I can't participate or anything like that. But in my case, I mean, history has shown that, like, where on earth was I not welcome? So it's like, I guess go ahead. But like you said, at some point, the more titles you put before the New York or the Pushcart Prize nominated author, at some point you end up in like a matchbox with all the little classifications you get. So
right, but I think it's
yogurt.
Important that we are
yogurt
making an effort.
It's yogurt, isn't it? Isn't it?
What?
Is that yogurt?
Oh, yes. I'm like, can he see me?
He's like, what is happening? Yeah, the internet, that's what does it all the time. But no, I pay a lot of attention to sounds. I think you know what I mean, though. Like when you're trying to pay attention to what something really sounds like. So instead of saying, they stirred the almost empty carton of yogurt, you could say, like, it sounded like the pearl getting sand rubbed over it inside the, I don't know, whatever, something like that.
I know what you mean.
some kind of bullshit like that. But yeah, I pay a lot of attention to sounds like that. So, anyways,
that's so funny. You totally freaked me out for a second.
Yeah, I had to tell you that other stuff just to alleviate your mind. What's up? Are you getting some strange light? Oh, am I too loud? Sorry. Okay, well, let's see. I suppose we should probably start wrapping up.
Yeah, it's been really fun though.
Yeah. And it'd be great to have you on at least every year. I mean, I love to say, every few months, but it's probably better to give you some space. But I wanted to, if anyone is still out there, we haven't had a question in about an hour, so I wanted to go
Oh
over.
man, I probably bored you.
No, I don't think
listeners.
so. I don't think so. Most of the time, and I found out most of the time they're just kind of listening and hanging out and listening. They may not necessarily be looking at the screen for their comments and memos and stuff. But
well, I've got a chapbook that I'm supposed to be writing for Dim
I
Shores.
love that it's supposed to be. That's cool.
Well,
That's
okay. Well, I was gonna say after that happens and it comes out next spring, we could talk about it at some point next year and find out what it is I wrote. Because
Okay. Wow.
I'm I have some ideas. I gotta fill at least 8,000 words.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind explaining the chapbook to me.
Okay, so, and this is something people always ask. So, a book is anywhere, usually a first novel is anywhere from 80,000 to 120,000 words. And a novella is at least 15,000 to 50,000. And a short story, runs 4, 5, 7,000 words. So a chapbook is right between a short story and a novella. So 8,000 to 15,000 words.
My God, that's so specialized.
Short book. Yes, it is. And I had actually not heard the term until just a few years ago. And most of the time that I had heard it, it was by friends of mine that write poetry, write chapbooks, and those are really popular in that genre. And Dim Shores puts out 2 or 3 chapbooks every year, and every chapbook gets its own artist that does the cover, and they only make 250 copies of that one chapbook. And so it's pretty cool to get asked by them to do a chapbook. And after I had done Heirloom for their anthology, Sam Cowan asked me if I would do a chapbook, and then things kind of got pushed off. But now I definitely have one coming out next spring with them. So I'm really excited about it.
I guess for the longest time, I thought chapbook was... I didn't think it had anything to do with length. I thought it had to do with production. I thought it was a smaller, thinner book that had a cardstock type cover that wasn't as glossy.
Is probably also to do with that.
Okay.
They're just also typically between the short story and the novella.
So since it's a chapbook and it's between the short story and novella, so it's just going to be a single story then, or it's supposed to be.
Honestly, Sam had told me I could do 2 stories because mine, as you know, typically run really short.
Yeah.
So
I think that was mostly my
couple of ideas.
Yeah. Okay.
So I might do 2 stories.
All right.
In the chapbook, I haven't decided yet. It depends. Once I sit down and I start writing, if one's gonna take off, then it'll be one.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess it's better to go organic. Even plotting for having it ready at a certain time was probably maddening occasionally. But
yeah, I think it's due in February. Look at me, I sound like such a professional. I'm I think I gotta get it in by February. Hopefully I start working on that really soon. I'm actually like I said, I came up with a couple of ideas that I'm really excited about. And we'll see if I can get them, either of them or both of them together to 8,000 words. So we're all going to find out together.
Okay.
What I end up writing for this chapbook that's coming out.
That's rocks. Okay, well, anyway, if anyone's left, I just wanted to completely recommend the story Heirloom that Brooke has put in the Looming Low Volume 1 from Dim Shores. It's an anthology that was nominated for the Shirley Jackson Award. So definitely check that out because Heirloom is a fantastic story, and I'm not telling you a damn thing about it because you have to go into it completely cold if you can manage
Well,
it.
there's so many good stories in that anthology too. Like that was just total rock stars in there. It's awesome.
And definitely, everyone check out the Wicked Library and the Lift podcast to hear some of Brooke's stories dramatized. Definitely go to Amazon and find Volume 1, Issue 3 of Vestarian, the literary journal, for her story I Feel Better Now, which is on the short list for the Pushcart Prize. Absolute short list, handful of authors. And that, like I said, that's available on Amazon. Thank you again, Brooke Warra, for being on the Diabolical Index tonight. It has been an absolute blast.
Thank you.
We probably
it's always fun talking to you.
It honestly, we probably could have talked 6 hours. There's no doubt about it.
For sure.
So we'll definitely have you on again, if not before. Definitely when the chapbook comes out, or somehow in service of the chapbook through Dim Shores, we'll get something going on that, and we will talk to you again and have you on and just ramble on wherever we feel like going.
Yeah,
So,
you watch Unico, and we'll
I'll
come
watch
back to that.
I'll watch Unico. And that Mark Twain weirdness. That sounded pretty cool
Yes,
too.
The Adventures of Mark Twain.
Yeah. So anyway, definitely go to brookewarra.com. Excuse me, BROOKEWARRA.com, and check out all of her awesome news about the world of writing and Washington. And so that is the Diabolical Index for December 10th, 2018, where the pages of the Uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson. This is Magic Squirrel Network, and as always, keep it squirrely.
The squirrel was magic!